Meet SAE International. You might not know us, but we've been with you. For the past 100 years, we've been revolutionizing transportation and mobility, partnering and supporting the dreamers, innovators, and can-doers who are changing the world. It's the child whose future career as an engineer will be shaped by our STEM education programs. It's the businesswoman boarding her flight with peace of mind, knowing that our committees have created the standards that ensure she gets from Detroit to Delhi and back again safely. It's the parents-to-be who are sleeping soundly, knowing that their electric car is fully charged and ready when it's go time. Driven by a passion to advance mobility knowledge and solutions, SAE's global community of over 200,000 engineers, technical experts, and volunteers continues to develop and curate the most reliable and comprehensive collection of engineering resources and consensus-based standards on Earth. The next mobility revolution is upon us. Connected and automated, electrified and sustainable. SAE will be here, as we have for the last 100 years, moving the world forward.
Welcome everybody to the Formula SAE Rules Event Overview presentation. Thank you for joining us today, and a big thanks to the SAE Detroit section in partnership with the SAE Carolina section for hosting this event. I am Matthew Meyer, your moderator. Just a little bit of background about me. I'm an SAE member from the Detroit section, and I graduated from Lawrence Tech University. I was in their Formula SAE program, and I was also the student chapter president. And today, I now work at General Motors as an EV propulsion engineer. Before we start, I want to address a couple of housekeeping items. All participants are automatically muted with their cameras off. We do encourage you to use the chat function to ask any questions you may have. You can start right now. I will take your questions and ask them to the presenter at the appropriate time. This presentation is being recorded and it will be posted on the SAE Detroit section YouTube channel at a later date. Today, we're going to be hearing from Steve Sayovitz, your Formula SAE Rules Chair. Steve will provide you with 2023 rules changes, how to use these rules and other important documents, and we'll answer common rules questions. And of course, we'll try to answer your live questions you provide today. Steve, good day and welcome. Thank you very much for being here today.
Good morning, Matt, and thank you very much. And again, thanks very much to the SAE Detroit section, the SAE Carolina section, for giving me the opportunity to speak with you this morning and give you a little bit of an overview on the Formula SAE rules.
Awesome. Let's get started.
All right. Well, first of all, my name is Steve Sayovitz. I'm the Formula SAE Rules Chair. I also do scorekeeping for the Formula SAE events here in North America. Been involved in Formula SAE since I was a freshman in college. It's been quite a long haul, but it's been good. I've enjoyed the experience, and I'm come back to help make it a better experience for everyone else who's come after me. So with that, we're going to talk a little bit about the Formula SAE rules for 2023. I'm going to cover some areas about the rules themselves, rules changes. I want to talk a little bit about how to use the rules and the terminology associated. Talk a little bit about some of the other documents that are there. We'll talk about some things that are common mistakes that we see, as well as talk about document submission, and definitely leave any time at the end for some questions you may have or any open discussion on topics, the rules, or even things just related to the rules. So with that, let's go begin. The Formula SAE rules themselves are the high-level document. They give the main requirements for the Formula SAE competition. They provide a good basis for a sound vehicle when built to those requirements. The rules are the same for everyone, yet they have to allow for some freedom in the individual designs, give you some different options for what you can do. For example, multiple chassis types, multiple powertrain types. So we're giving you some freedom, some flexibility, rather than trying to tie you into one specific design or configuration. Now, for the 2023 season, we did issue a draft for public comments back in August. We received about 100 comments coming back in, so that was good. And from that, we did make some changes to the draft document before we published version 1. That was in early September this past year. And with that, we are planning a version 2 of the rules that is upcoming. And that's not to make major changes, but that's to clarify a couple of things that have come up, as well as to incorporate some late comments that came in on those rules. Don't have a scheduled date for that yet, but just be aware it is coming. So with that, what did we change for 2023? Well, the first thing I'm going to cover is section F on the chassis and structural. A couple of different things were changed. For aluminum tubing, we now allow you to use a thinner wall aluminum tubing if it is non-welded. If it is welded, there's no change from the previous year's rules. For any holes or openings in tubing, we don't want to see those open ends, as that provides a weak spot in the design itself. So particularly in any kind of side view, if there's an open end on tubing, you need to have a plug or a cap on it. Now, the only exception is for the bottoms of the main hoop and front hoop. We do allow you to have that open end. Attachment of the anti-intrusion plate and impact attenuator. That received a number of changes to try and cover the different options there. Now, you know there is a standard impact attenuator. There's one made out of foam and one made out of honeycomb. You can use either one of those without testing, as long as you put a tube across the front bulkhead. So it has to have some structure behind it. And that's mostly what we've clarified that in the rules this year, but that really is not a change in practice from what we've been asking you to do the last year or two. There's also some details about the attachment itself. So rather than trying to cover that right now, just please be aware of that. There's a new item on steering protection. And that's when the steering rack is underneath or on top of the chassis and exposed, such that it would be the first thing that would make contact if you ran into an obstacle or under an obstacle. There's some rules on that, mainly just to provide some type of protection on it or to locate it in a more suitable location. And then also for electric vehicles, the tractive system side impact protection height. Now that used to require you go all the way to the height of the side impact structure. And now the tractive system, if you have, for example, your accumulators to the side, that would only need to cover the height of the accumulator. So just trying to clarify what our requirements are there. Continuing in the chassis structural area, specifically to monocoque designs. Any test samples that you present to us must have a permanent marking, and that's something like an engraving or cutting into it to identify that sample in a permanent way. The other thing we're looking at is if you have portions of the monocoque where you have corners, and sometimes teams were not using core in those corners and just having it just be the skins. Now that is no longer allowed when used for full equivalence. when you laminate a front hoop into a monocoque chassis, there's some additional requirements now to enclose it with some plies of skin and use a specifically sculpted core around it. Attachments, we've tried to clarify how you attach items to a monocoque chassis. And then the harness mount testing for the monocoques, that's clarifying the direction and what we're looking for in the specific circumstances. Now, there is also, for further detail, I'm going to point you to an article posted on a website called designjudges.com. Now, granted, that is not an official communication source. I want to emphasize that, but that is written by one of our structural equivalency spreadsheet leads. There's a lot of photos and additional explanation, or I should say illustrations, additional explanations. It's good information. So please take a look at that if you have not done so already.
Hey, Steve, I got a question that came in that says, what type of identification is needed in the sample monocoque?
For the monocoque samples, there's some specific requirements either listed in the rules or the structural equivalency spreadsheet. Generally, it would be things like the date of the test, applies an identifier, so you know so we and you can identify what type of what the configuration of the layup is. But that information, I believe, is in the rules and in the structural equivalency spreadsheet itself.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, continuing with rules changes in section T for technical rules. The accumulator container itself may not be part of the electric vehicle firewall. The firewall and the container must be separate. That was a posted change, likely change listed in the previous rule set, and we've now made that permanent. Brake lines in the electric vehicle firewall. There's always some questions there about what the requirements were, and we've tried to clarify that. Harnesses to the 1998 FIA specification have been removed. Once we get into calendar year 2023, none of them will no longer be valid. So no sense to have that specification listed anymore. We did try to clarify that the pedal box is separate from the brake system itself. There's some questions that come in relating to the pedal box when they're applying rules from the brake system section. There's a few rule changes for the electric vehicles themselves, more of a housekeeping thing. There's a new section 4.2 that really is just moving steps that were in other sections previously. There's a reminder for the tractive system measuring point power rating, but it's been checked in the ESF. It also now has a note in the rules about it. Bolted connections in the tractive system. This has been one that's gotten a lot of questions and over the last couple of years, but it used to reference the positive locking mechanisms section, which is really intended for structural applications. But for electrical applications, that some of those ideas aren't the best. For example, trying to use safety wire to tie multiple sets of bolts together. Well, you don't want to do that on an electric vehicle. So we're providing you some options there because it no longer points you back to that positive locking mechanisms section. You still need to use some type of a positive mechanism, but it doesn't need to follow those rules anymore. And on the overcurrent protections, tried to clarify is less than or equal to, just to say what we're getting at. And then the brake system plausibility device. The draft had some additional changes that we ended up not implementing. However, there are still some requirements, and I will say going forward, that does need to be improved for both electric vehicles and combustion engine vehicles. So that's, we didn't fundamentally change anything for 2023, but through that whole discussion, we found that we really do need to make some improvements on that, mainly that they're really not consistent between combustion and the electric sections. A couple other changes I do want to mention. For combustion vehicles, fueling and refueling. We actually changed the procedures to that so that it is at the discretion of the officials. What we're trying to accomplish there is to make sure that we get the cars fully fueled. And then the cost event, we specifically removed the electronic bill of material, so it's no longer required. Our process and the website has gotten advanced enough that the cost report does serve the purpose quite well, and that's what we're using now for the judging. And then we also removed the specific cost scoring and some of the details from the rules. We're going to provide that separately. It's similar to what is done for the presentation event. You'll notice we provide that scoring criteria separately outside the rules as well. If you look at the last 2 years, we've tried a couple of things with the cost event, and our cost event captains do have some ideas going forward that we'll decide what we're going to do and communicate that to you prior to the event. Okay, talking a little bit about the rules themselves and how to use the rules, and there's some terms that are used throughout the rules that I want to go over just briefly. And these are listed in the general regulations, step 4.1. The first term you'll see in the rules is must. That's a requirement. That is mandatory, things that you must do. There's also must not, which is things you don't do and you are not allowed to do. There's also the term should. That is something we expect you to do. It is recommended, but it is not strictly a requirement in the rule. And the last term is may. That gives permission. Officials may inspect the car at any time. So it is not a requirement. It is not a restriction. It just gives permission. And we do still get some questions on the terminology sometimes, so that's why I wanted to include that here. So some advice on the rules themselves. Keep a copy that you can refer to and check and make sure it is the correct version. If you're still using the draft, please delete that. Go on FSAE online, download the latest copy. And use the rules document. You stay what's called rule-based. You go to the actual rule and read it. Make sure you're complying with it. And don't assume what you think. If you're working off of the set of rules that's in your head, that's what's called knowledge-based. And that is not anywhere near as reliable and accurate as it is to go to the rules and read them, confirm it. As always, you can ask some rules questions if you need to. We do take a look at those, and sometimes even we get into rules changes based on some of the questions that have been asked.
Steve, I'd like to stop you at that last slide.
Sure.
I really think your first bullet point, I guess all of these bullet points are very important, but I remember on the team, we would print out all different rules and make them into little books. We'd also make them into large copies, have them in binders. There'd be copies all over the lab. Definitely, have them go to Kinko, go somewhere where you can print out a very durable copy where you can flip through them. I would say, so the pages don't get greasy, like have a really nice copy of the rules. And when you do go to comp, I would suggest to students, make sure there's one person that always has the rules book on them somewhere. And that will be, part of their job is to flip out the rule book, because we're always, students are always making last minute changes. And I do have a question for you on that last comment. Ask rules questions if you need to. Are there any, I have a question. Is there a place, or what or where are the best places for teams to go to discuss with maybe other teams about rules or rules changes? Are there any online forums that you know? Is there a certain location that you can point teams to?
Well, myself, I don't, I mean, there's several, my understanding is there's several online locations where teams do discuss things amongst themselves. I don't necessarily know all of them, and I don't necessarily know which are the best ones to look at.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Sure. And that's good advice about being on a team and being able to look at the rules like that. One of the things I would say is if I ever got called into a question about the rules when I'm at the competition, the first thing I would do is say, well, okay, let's all pause here for a second. Let's all read the rule in question. And once we all read the rule in question, then we can discuss it, because then we've all gone back and said, okay, here's what we're looking at.
Yep.
All right.
Thank you.
Sure. And continuing, the rules themselves, as I mentioned, are the top level document. It gives the requirements, but they do not give guidance. But there are a number of sources which do go beyond the requirements and start giving some guidance and specific details. Things like the structural equivalency spreadsheet, the electrical systems form, and even the cost supplement. So you really have to use those other documents along with the rules. One of the things I've always advocated is when you're doing, for example, your structural design, you should be working on your design with the rules open on one side, the structural equivalency spreadsheet open on the other side. When you're working on electrical design, same thing, except rules on one side, electrical systems form on the other. Because what you'll find is sometimes you can make things easier on yourself when you go to one of the structural equivalency or the electrical systems form, that can make your design, that way you'll pass very easily, as opposed to finding that maybe at a late stage you're having some trouble passing that. Because with that, a couple of common mistakes, and the first one relates to what we just talked about. Sometimes you'll try to do the design and build using only the rules, which, you want to be using the rules, but sometimes the rules do not get very specific. A common question is, well, it says equivalent, how do we show equivalent? Well, if it's a structural piece, you have to go to the structural equivalency spreadsheet, for example. Another problem that we see sometimes is that teams will try to design and build very close to the limits in the rules. Well, okay, that's a decision that you make. However, depending on how close you get to the limits, that may cause you some issues with trying to get some of your documents approved prior to the competition. In addition, you may design it very specifically, but can you build it that accurately? You may get to tech inspection and find out that, oh, you're slightly over the limit. And now you have to try and be modifying it at the event, which in some cases can be very difficult. Another thing that we see is, although we do provide a list of highlighted changes in the rules, don't just review that list of changes and think, oh, everything else is the same. Well, there's a lot of times we may try to clarify things or not list a lot of specific details. So if you look, there's only about 20 or 30 changes noted. Some of them are changes in entire sections, even though it may be the section is listed as a changed item, but portions of that section have changed. The actual list of full rules changes is on the order of 120 items this year. So they're not all listed. So again, don't just try to go by the changes, still open up and use the rules.
Steve, is there a common area in the rule book that you find teams missing? Like, as an example, maybe fasteners, types of fasteners, the way they're supposed to be held down, or positive locking. Like, is there common year after year issues with students not understanding the rule books? Or maybe it's around firewall, or is it kind of all over the place?
There seems to be some areas that get a lot of questions. One of the questions that comes up a lot is in the area of critical fasteners, sometimes and positive locking devices. For example, does every fastener on the car need to meet the critical fastener rules? The answer is actually no, they do not. But how would you know? Well, if that particular area in the rules calls out critical fasteners, then you need to meet critical fastener rules. An example I will give you is a couple of years ago, we actually took the critical fasteners requirement away from the electric vehicle accumulator container construction. So you don't need critical fasteners to build the enclosure for your accumulator. However, you do need to have critical fasteners to attach your accumulator to your chassis. So that's the difference there. And then under positive locking devices, there's examples that are given in the rules, but the examples are actually not the requirements. They're just examples. The requirements are actually in the step prior to that.
Okay. I have a question about that.
Sure.
Can you explain if Loctite is okay as a positive locking mechanism?
Loctite does not meet the requirements for a positive locking mechanism, because the two requirements for positive locking mechanism are visible and does not rely on the torque itself to hold it tight. So Loctite would not be considered visible. Now, going forward, there may be you may have the ability to work with that when you get to electric vehicles, because that, again, does not invoke positive locking, but you have to be careful with the temperature requirements, because we do want to make sure that that for the temperatures expected, that you'll still maintain that positive locking.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we'll talk a little bit about document submissions. Document submissions are things like structural equivalency spreadsheet, electrical systems form, but then that also gets into the cost report, your design documents, your design review briefing, and spec sheet. So a lot of documents you're needing to submit. Format of those, check the requirements, because that may change every year. Every year we have last year's form getting turned in again. Not that we think you're trying to use the same thing as last year, you probably just never picked up that did change. Another example is we've used the design review briefing now for, I believe it's two years or 3 years. And yet last year we still had a couple of teams turn in a design report, which was the requirement previous to that. So check your requirements, check the format every year. Our upload system only allows one file at a time. So we've had a couple of situations where multiple files have been uploaded into the system and all it recognizes is the last one. So we watch those formats on that. With that, we also have some things with the deadlines. First of all, does everyone know the deadlines? They are now posted at fsaeonline.com. There's actually a link right at the top of the screen that says deadlines. And all document submissions are now open. You can go submit any of the documents right now. Now, one of the things about the deadlines is we always have a lot of waiting to submit, and this is not exaggerating. About 90% of the submissions seem to come in the last 24 hours before the deadline, and about half of them in the last 2 hours. So, there's no prize for coming in as close to the deadline as possible. And I'd recommend you allow yourself some additional time, be it 24 or 48 hours if you really want to wait until the end. 24, 48 hours prior to the deadline, because if everyone's trying to submit, we have had some slowdowns on it, and there's teams that have come in, 1 or 2 minutes past the deadline. With that, I'm going to editorialize a little bit. We've had a big problem the last couple of years because team documents have been submitted after the deadline. Those teams receive penalty points. We have exercised some discretion at times, but there's so many documents being submitted late. Realize that last year there was some wording issues with the deadlines on the website that did confuse some of the teams. I believe this year with the deadlines on fsaeonline.com, that should not be an issue because it very clearly says deadline and the second date says cancellation. So that should make it very clear when the deadline is. But please, those documents deadlines are now published. Put them on your calendar and make sure you submit on time. That's easy and totally under your control. Now with those documents, we encourage you to submit as early as possible. However, some of them must be pretty much close to complete. And if they are complete, you could get some early approval or you could get some more time. And we always get some comments from teams about, well, when can we get some feedback on it? Some teams, in all honesty, really need a little bit of feedback on it. And if you submit early enough, you'll have time to fix that, correct that, and still support your design and build schedule. Now we realize, because in some cases you need to do your design or you still need to do some testing and fabrication, say for composite panels, for example, that it's not always possible to submit them very early. And that's okay. We understand that. A little bit of detail on the structural equivalency spreadsheet. Now, early submissions on those get reviewed and approved first. And as of earlier this week, 16 teams had submitted. It's now, just this morning I looked, and it's up to now about 20 teams. So very good. And we've gotten comments back to 10 of those teams already. We've actually approved 2 teams. So if Purdue West Lafayette and Bradley University are online, congratulations, you're the first. So in regards to the rules and the formula competition in general, please give us comments and provide feedback. And really, the question and what you need to tell us is, how can we make it better? We can't fix any issues unless we know that they're issues. And also, once you graduate, please consider coming back and volunteering at the competition. Now, you don't necessarily need to volunteer at the competition itself, because we need some document reviewers, and that happens all throughout the year. And you can do that from wherever you currently are located. And we also can use some technical inspectors, particularly electric vehicles. Now that we're getting some more team members who have come through an electric vehicle program, we hope you'd come back and help us out with some tech inspection. With that,
Steve, can I ask you a few questions just on this slide? How can
absolutely.
students best provide feedback?
There's a
At
couple.
competition or through an email?
Well, there's a couple ways that it can be done. At the competition, obviously they can speak directly with us if they'd like. There's also surveys that are put out after the competition. You can also send an email to the SAE itself. There's a collegiate competitions at SAE.org is probably the best one to do that. And
Okay. All right. And I just, one quick thing, I just want to make a note to everybody that's on the call. If you do have a question, please make sure you're using the chat function so I can ask Steve it. Question for you, Steve. Can teams request changes to future rules revisions? Is there a way that they can do that? Is it just with emailing you or talking to you at competition? Maybe they have a suggestion on the rule. There should be a rule change in such area.
okay. We don't have a specific formal process for requesting rules changes. Again, it's probably best to just send an email message through either contact@SAE or that collegiate competitions at SAE.org mailbox, and that would get distributed to whoever needs that.
Okay. At competition, who is the absolute best person to talk to on any rules questions? I'm going to guess it could be a tech inspector. It could be yourself.
Well, there's different areas. If you're talking, for example, an area in tech inspection, that would probably be best to discuss that with either the individual tech inspector, or they could also identify that to one of the tech leads. We have tech leads for both the mechanical tech and the electrical tech. And as part of mechanical tech, actually gotten very good in the last couple of years of getting our structural reviewers, those who review the structural equivalency spreadsheets, to actually work with tech inspection as well. So there's several ways that could be done.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any maybe tips or tricks for getting brand new team members up to speed on all of the rules? I know we're kind of somewhat early in the year, in the school year, and the teams probably have gone out, the current teams or last year's teams have gone out and recruited maybe a lot of new students, and they're flush with new students. How can we get students up to date in their respective areas of the rules? Is it just basically reading through the whole document and then maybe focusing on the area that they're responsible for? Do you have any tips or tricks to try to get the students to understand the whole rule book?
Well, it's interesting. In the last couple of years, one of the things we've seen is that there was, with the not having the competitions in calendar year 2020, it seemed like some of the programs that were even fairly well established didn't have as much of the knowledge transfer as they often do. Because some of the teams, what I would suggest is that if you're able to, get some of your newer members involved, ideally are able to go to one of the formula competitions and see what happens, what goes on with it. There's the rules as well, just trying to understand in concept, what we're allowing and what we're not allowing in terms of just trying to focus on their specific area. That's probably the best way to do it.
Okay. All right, well, thank you. I'll make one last call for any questions that anybody has. Please make sure to use the chat function. I have gone through all of the questions I've received. They've been great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Steve, do you have any other slides you'd like to share or any other information while we're waiting for those questions to come in?
Just going as an update, you know, I did mention that there will be a version 2 of the 2023 rules that is forthcoming. And, you know, do have a couple of things to work with on that. It is not intended to change anything you're currently working towards, but there have been a couple of questions that have come up about a few areas. So.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm not being asked any more questions. So if you could, please go to the next slide. Thank you very much. So please remember for everyone online that our next virtual event is the Formula SAE alignment overview on Friday, November 18th. And you can register by going to the SAE-Detroit.org webpage and clicking on the little register button. This presentation will introduce you to vehicle alignment terms and explain the effects on steering and handling. It will also serve as a foundation for the presentations on tires and steering. Students are encouraged to ask questions and be a part of the live conversation. Tim Dorter, lead engineer in advanced vehicle dynamics at Stellantis, will be your moderator. And the presenter will be Daryl Hancock, a senior technical specialist in vehicle dynamics at Stellantis. We also have more virtual events coming later this year and in 2023, which you can see on your screen. If you can go to the next slide for me, Steve. I do want to thank all of our participants for joining in our rules event overview event. Thank you to today's presenter, Steve, and to the SAE Detroit section staff, as well as the SAE Carolina section staff for their involvement in putting together today's presentation. For any questions or inquiries about this presentation, please email the SAE Detroit section staff at events@sae-detroit.org, which is shown on your screen. If you're watching this on YouTube, please consider liking this video, sharing it with someone who you might find useful, and subscribing to our SAE Detroit section YouTube channel. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks.